In this series, we will go over the default layout of Illustrator, basic shape tools, the line segment tool, image hierarchy, fill and stroke, transforms, opacity, blend modes, and groups. I know this sounds like a lot, but we're going to break it down into smaller pieces. And we're going to start by designing a simple background using the rectangle shape tool, some simple transforms, and by changing the fill and stroke settings, opacity, and blend mode. If you are on a Mac, you can go up to the Finder, this magnifying glass here in the corner, and you can type in, if you type in Illustrator, or ILL even, Adobe Illustrator will be the first hit. Oftentimes this program will also show up in your dock, so if you come down to the bottom of the screen, it will show up here in the dock. If you're in Windows, you can also do a search or go to your program files, and you should be able to find it in there. So when you open Illustrator, the first thing you're going to need to do is create a new file. As you can see, we've got our tools and some other things out, but we don't have any window to work in. So we're going to go up to File at the top of the screen, and we're going to go to New. And when we open that window, we're going to get a new document dialog box. And this allows us to set several settings for the file before we even get started. So first, let's go ahead and rename this file background, because that's what we're going to be creating. And then under the profile, instead of custom, by default, yours should be set up to this. It should be set to print, and it should be set to the size should be letter, and it's 612 points by 792 points. This is a standard 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. That's what it's telling you it's doing. And you'll notice the color mode is CMYK, and the raster effects are 300 ppi, which is pixels per inch. Now, this profile, the print profile, is intended to be used for print media. Because what we're going to be working on is meant for the web, it's meant to be online, we're going to change the profile from print to web. And when we make this change, you'll see that a couple things have changed. First, it says 960 by 560, and you'll see that points has changed to pixels. If you're unfamiliar, a pixel is the smallest, basically visible unit on your screen. Your screen is composed of pixels, millions of them. And so by default, it sets it to 960 by 560 pixels. We're going to change those values, the width and the height, to 1000, right? We're just going to make a nice big square. You'll also notice, oops, that's 100, not 1000. You'll also notice that the color mode has changed from CMYK to RGB. That's what we want, because pixels, each pixel has a red, green, and blue light in it, essentially, and you get the different colors by varying how bright each of those three lights are. And so that's what we want. We want the color mode to be RGB. And the raster effects, it says screen 72 ppi. That's the standard resolution of a computer monitor. However, recently, many manufacturers have started making much higher pixel density screens. Apple calls it the Retina display. Other people are talking about 4K or 5K displays. And so this is starting to change. In order to make things look decent on your screen, we're going to go ahead and bump that up to medium, right, to 150 ppi. That should make the raster effects look a little nicer. The raster effects only come in when we do certain particular things to our images, because generally Illustrator is a vector-based drawing program. Okay, and so preview mode is default, align new objects to pixel grid, great. We're going to hit OK. And when we do this, we get this nice big window that opens up. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is there's a big white box on a gray background. This big white box is called the artboard. The artboard has no color. It's completely transparent, right? It's just a space for you to work that has boundaries. Now, in Illustrator, you can actually do stuff off here in the gray as well. And you can change the size of your artboard. You can create multiple artboards. But right? Basically, all of our artwork, if we want things to print out correctly, we're going to be doing on the artboard. It also makes blending look like it's supposed to look. So if you have transparent colors overlaying one another, they're going to look weird on the gray versus on the white. Okay, so this is the artboard. This is our main window that we do the work in. Illustrator has three other primary areas that we're going to be using extensively. The first is the control panel, and that is this bar here, where currently we have, it says no selection. We've got a couple options here, all this stuff. Basically, anytime you have a specific tool or an object selected, your options for what you can do with that tool or with that object are going to be listed in this area. Along the left-hand side of the screen, we have got all of our tools, right? These are subdivided by these light gray lines into general use, right? These are all basically drawing tools. These are all ways to do transforms, which is anytime you rotate or stretch or change or scale, basically change your image in some way once you've drawn it, right? That's a transform. So these are all transform tools. These are more color-based and gradient-based things. So this is a lot of color selection tools. These two tools we're not really going to use too much. And then these tools are for zooming. The hand tool allows you to grab your whole artboard and move it around the window. So if you're zoomed way in, you can use the hand tool to drag across to get to some other detail that you might need to modify. This allows you to change colors, and we'll talk about that really briefly. And then you can change the screen mode, and we're not going to worry about that yet. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are the panels. These panels allow you to change a lot of different settings. They open up more options than you have just with your control panel at the top of the screen. And there's multiple ways to get to these different control panels as well, and we'll talk about that as the course goes on. Now we need to start drawing. And we're going to be making this background out of several rectangles. And so the first thing I want you to do is head over to your tools. And surprisingly enough, the tool that looks like a rectangle is called the rectangle tool. You'll also notice that when I hover over it, I get this yellow thing. It tells me what it is and also has the letter M in brackets. And what that means is that's the quick key. So if I hit the letter M on my keyboard, you'll see that it selects the rectangle tool. So I can either click on this to select it with my mouse, or I can hit the letter M to select the rectangle tool. And so what you do to start drawing a rectangle is you click in one corner and drag across the screen. Now, if I just hold my mouse button down and I'm clicking and dragging and moving this around, you'll see that I can set this to any sort of ratio that I want. I can make it long and narrow. I can make it, tall but short, whatever I want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and release my mouse button now. And as soon as I do this, this thing highlights in blue. And currently it doesn't look like I've done anything except draw a completely transparent box. And that's because currently the background color of the rectangle is white. The stroke color is black, but it's so thin that this blue line is covering it up. This blue line is called the bounding box. It essentially lets you know that this is the object you have selected. And when we start to talk about layers, we're going to create new layers. And each layer, the bounding box is a different color. So on this layer, this is just layer 1 or layer 0, the bounding box is this light blue color. On the next layer, if we create another layer, then the bounding boxes for that layer would be red or green or pink or purple or whatever you want them to be. And so it's just a way of organizing, knowing what you've selected and what layer that you're on. Okay, so the bounding box has two essential things, right? There's these square points on the corners. Those are called anchor points. And then if I hover over the line, I also get this green word that says path, right? So the path, every single object in Illustrator is comprised of a path that's bounded by anchor points, right? So as you draw a curve, you're going to have anchor points, and there's going to be a path between them. If it's a straight line, it's two anchor points and a path between them. Right? So everything is made up of this. And then we just tell Illustrator what we want to do to that path. Do we want the interior to be filled? Do we want it to be open? Do we want to have a stroke on it or not? let's go ahead and change the fill and stroke color of this box in order to make it stand out from our background. So to do that, we come up to the options panel. Sorry, the control panel. It's called the options bar in Photoshop, and we'll talk about that later. But you'll see first, this is the object type, it's a path. And the first two options we have here are the stroke and fill color. So the first one is the fill color. If I click on this, and let's say I'm going to change it to green, so it stands out. Now I have a green box, I can change this to magenta. There's other ways to do the colors. These are called swatches, they're preset colors. We're just going to be using those to start with because it's super fast and easy to select them. And then let's change the stroke color to something else as well. So we're going to click on this, and let's go ahead and make the stroke color magenta because that stands out against green really well. And then the next option we have is the stroke weight. And the stroke weight is currently 1 point. If we click on this drop down arrow, we can just select, a point weight, like let's say 10 points. That's a big, thick purple line that you can see. We've got this fill and stroke color set. So let's go ahead and draw another rectangle. Now this time, let's say we actually want to draw a square rather than some arbitrary rectangle. To do that, I'm going to click and drag, and as I start to do this, I'm going to hold down the Shift key. And when I do that, now this is locked into square dimensions. I can scale it up to whatever size I want it to be, but it's going to be square. And let's say I want it to be just as wide as our existing rectangle. So I'm going to pull this thing out, and if I come close, you'll see that suddenly I get this snap and there's a green line, and it says intersect. That means that this is perfectly aligned with the other rectangle. So I'm going to let go of my mouse, let go of the Shift key, and now I have a perfect square. And at this point I want to show you another way to check and make sure that you actually do have a perfect square, or a way which you could change your object very precisely if you need to. So in the control panel up here, if I go all the way to the end, you'll see this W and H, and it says 574 pixels by 574 pixels. So let's say I actually want this to be 500, and for some reason it has to be 590 pixels. I can just highlight this field, I can type in 590, and you'll see that it changes, and I can come over here and I can type in 590 as well, hit enter, and it will change the dimensions, right? And it's still square. I can even constrain these. If I click on this button, I can set this value to 700, and when I do that, it will automatically change the other value to match. All right, let's change this back to 600 just so it's not overlapping the other rectangle. So I've got these two rectangles I've drawn. Now the issue is I want to move them. Let's say I want to move these, or I want to adjust the dimensions of this first one, but if I try and click on it now, I'm just going to draw another rectangle. So if you did draw another rectangle, if you're on the Mac, hit Command-Z to undo your last action. If you're on Windows, you're going to need to hit Control-Z. So I'm going to hit Command-Z. I'm going to undo that. And what I need to do is I need to use the selection tool. So the next tool we're going to look at is this dark filled in arrow. This is the selection tool. You'll notice that the letter V is the quick key for this. And by the way, I highly suggest using quick keys rather than moving your mouse over here every single time you need to choose a tool, right? Because if you're trying to select things, and let's say we need to move this, and then maybe we need to draw another rectangle really quickly, it's so much faster to use the quick keys than it is to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So the letter V is the quick key for the selection tool. So this will allow us, if we just click once on either of these, we can move our mouse and select either object. This also allows us to make modifications to the object, a few simple modifications, right? So the first thing we can do is if we hover over one of these corner anchor points, it doesn't matter which one, we can click and drag and we can rescale this rectangle. And you'll notice that it scales around the opposite corner, right? So this corner was opposite the one I had selected, and so that is where it was essentially pinned to the artboard. If I come up here and grab this, it's going to do the same thing, but just the other corner. I can also choose to expand one side at a time, so I can just pull this side out. I can click down here in the center of this, pull this side down, If I click anywhere in the center of this object, it will move around, right? I can move it. One other thing I can do is if I hover outside the corner, right? If I'm on top of the corner, it gives me this option to scale it. If I hover just outside the corner, it gives me this other icon, which I'm going to zoom in on real quick. All right, it gives me this other icon, which is the rotation icon. So if I zoom back out to full screen here, if I have that rotation icon and I click and drag, it allows me to rotate this rectangle in any direction that I want. Now, something to note, anytime you want to do something and have it snap to a particular size, such as right before when we were scaling up the rectangle and we wanted it to be square, we held down Shift to get that to happen. If you want to rotate this 45 or 90 degrees and have it stick to that, if you hold down the Shift key while you're rotating, it will only allow you to rotate it right in those directions. So I'm going to let go at 45. All right, so I have this rectangle that's on its side now, that's at an angle to this other rectangle. And something else you'll notice is that the first rectangle I drew is underneath the second rectangle I drew. That's important to remember, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to select all of these objects and delete them. There's two ways I can do that. I can either hold down, if I'm on the Mac, I hold down Command A. If I'm on Windows, I need to hold down Control A, and that will allow me to select all of my objects. I can also select one object, hold down the Shift key, and select another object, and that allows me to select multiple objects. And one final way I can select everything is I can click and drag off here in space in the gray area, and you'll see I get this little light rectangle that I'm drawing. And if I pull that out and expand it around the entire board, that will also select all of the objects that that gray outline touches. All right, so to delete anything, you just hit the delete key and they're gone. What do we want our pattern to be? Let's start, we're going to make a pretty rudimentary pattern. So let's start by making a rectangle that is 1/4 the size of the artboard, and we're going to start up in this corner. So in order to use the rectangle tool, I can either move my mouse over there and click on the rectangle, or I can hit the letter M on the keyboard. And another nice thing is that I can hover over this corner, and right where when I get to the corner, it says intersect. That means that I am directly on top of that corner. And now if I click and drag, I can pull this thing out. And I could hold down Shift at this point. However, I know from experience that when I get to the center of the artboard, this is going to snap it's going to snap it into center. And you'll notice that there's a little gray box that says W and H, and both are 500 pixels. That means I have a square, and it's 1/4 of the size of the entire screen. So I'm going to create this beautiful rectangle. Now from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw another square that's 1/4 the size of the current square. And to do that, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to hover over where it says anchor up here in the top left-hand corner. I'm going to click and drag, and when I get to the center of this square, the same thing's going to happen. Now I have a green background, so I can't actually see very well. So maybe what I'll do is I'll release this, I'm going to undo it, and I'm going to change the color of this rectangle just to make it a lot easier to see. So I'm going to choose orange because orange and green stand out much better. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to redo this. So I'm going to click, I'm going to drag. When I get close to the center, it's going to snap in and it's going to say center. So I'm going to release this, and now I've got a box that's 1/4 of the size of this box, that's 1/4 of the size of the entire thing. And if you can't tell where we're going from here, we're going to basically be creating 4 squares that we're then going to copy and paste so that we get a grid pattern across the entire object. Now what we need to do is we need to create a few copies of this square. Now one way we could do that is we could either hit Command or Control C, Command C if you're on the Mac, Control C if you're on Windows, and then Command or Control V. Now in Illustrator, one of the things that I find annoying is that when you copy it, it pastes it somewhere. In this case, it's right in the center of the artboard. That's not always the case. And then you have to drag it back to wherever you want it. There's a much faster way to copy and paste objects in Illustrator. So I'm going to delete this object. And I'm going to need to select this object again, so I'm going to use the selection tool, which means that I need to hit the letter V on the keyboard or go over and click the dark arrow. And then I need to click once to select this small square. And once I've done that, if I hold down the Option key or the Option key on Mac, the Alt key in Windows, you'll see that my cursor changes and I have this dark arrow overlapped by an open arrow. If I click and drag at this point, it's going to create a copy. And you'll notice that even as I'm dragging this, if I stay somewhere close to center, it's going to snap this to the center for me. So I'm just going to drag this over. And then once I get to the edge of this other square, it's going to snap to intersect, which means it's perfectly aligned again. And now I just have to release. And I've got two squares, right? You can see that now I've got these two squares on top and nothing on the bottom. So now what I want to do is I want to select both of these squares and drag them down here. Now to do that, if I was just to click and drag out here, it would actually select all three objects, right? It's selecting the background square, it's selecting the top two squares. That's not what I want to do. So what I'm going to need to do in this case is use the Shift key. So I'm going to click on one square, then hold down Shift, and select the other square. Now once I've got both of those squares selected, I can hold down the Option key, and I can click and drag down, and look at this, I've selected both objects, I've copied them both at the same time, and now I can make sure they're intersecting, release the Option key, release the mouse button, and I have four squares overlapping this one larger square. So now we have four squares that are all orange. Let's go ahead and change the colors. And we're going to do two things. First, we're going to get rid of the stroke on all of these. And so what I want to do is I want to select all four of these squares. So I'm going to click on one, I'm going to hold down Shift, click on the next, Shift, click, Shift, click. Now, something else you can do, if you accidentally select one too many objects, you can also hold down Shift and click on one of your selected objects, and it will deselect that object, right? Okay, so I've got these all four selected. So let's go ahead and under the stroke in the options bar, the control panel, you'll see that currently it's set to magenta. However, if I go to this very first option with the red line through it, that is none. That means it's going to turn the stroke off. So if I click on this, suddenly I have no stroke. It looks like I have one big orange square. So now I'm going to select each of these squares independently and change the color. So I'm going to select the first square here. If you get this heavy dark blue outline, that means that you've got all four of these still selected and you've created what's called a key object here. We don't want to do that, so I'm just going to click off in the gray area here, which means that I won't have anything selected whatsoever. Then I'm going to hover over here, and you'll notice that Illustrator is nice in that it, even before you select something, it gives you an outline of the object you're hovering over. So I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to change the color of this first one to this green here. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go through and we're going to color one this color, the next color, the next color, the next color, right? So I'm going to start here with this first one that really looks green. I'm going to come over, select the next object, come down, select the next color green that's darker. Then I'm going to select the third object here. So we get this color darkening as we rotate through the different. Right, as we start up here, we're going to cycle down here to the darker color, from lighter to darker. And was this the right one? Nope, I'm going to need to do this one. Okay, so I've got my four squares all colored independently. Now, what I need to do is I need to get them off the top of this big square, because we're just going to delete the big square. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select all four of these squares again. And then I'm just going to click and drag the entire thing over until it's aligned with the other side of the artboard. And then I will select my big orange square and I'm going to hit delete. We were just using that square as a way to create a guide essentially for 1/4 of our page. So we've got these four squares. One thing that is starting to annoy me at least is the fact that every time I want to move all four of these things or do something to all four of them, I have to select them over and over again. I can't just click on one and have them all selected. So what I want to do is I want to create what's called a group. And what that does is it allows you to take 4 independent objects, or any number of independent objects, and turn them into one contiguous object, right? Or a group of objects. And so then you click once to select it, it allows you to, it speeds up your process immensely. So to do that, I can either hit Control G in Windows or Command G on the Mac, or I can go up to the menu options at the top of the screen and I can go to Object and Group. Those are the 3 ways to do this. If you ever forget how to do it, going to Object and Group is always going to make sense. But obviously the key combo is much faster. So I'm going to hit Command G. And when I do that, if I click off in space now, so nothing is selected, and then click once, you'll see that wherever I click, the entire object has been selected. So now we need to copy and paste this on top of itself and then rotate it 45 degrees and shrink it so it fits within the boundaries of this other square. So in order to do that, we can't do the option click thing. I mean, we could option drag it and then bring it back on there, but that's kind of a waste of time. What we're going to do instead is we're going to use the Command or Control C to copy. And Illustrator has where Command or Control V pastes it just anywhere on the page. Command or Control F pastes it in front of the object that you've copied. So if I hit Command F, it's going to copy it. It's going to paste it right in front, so you don't see any visual change. However, if you don't need to do this. I'm just going to drag this over so you can see that there are indeed 2 objects here. Right? Now I'm going to put it back. Okay, so now I need to rotate this 45 degrees. In order to do that, I'm going to hover outside the corner just a little bit. And I'm going to click and drag, and then I'm going to hold down Shift, rotate it this way. Now what I'd really like is for this dark square to be where this light green one is. So I'm going to do this rotation 2 more times. So I'm going to click, I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm going to rotate it 1 more time, 2 more times, 3 more times. I think 4 times should do it. Nope, that was 1 too many. So I'm going to go back 1. All right, and remember that it is rotating it into the, on top of the other square in between these steps. Okay, so now I have this dark green square on the top in this case, and I've got this set. Now, we need to modify the shape of this, right? We've got our selection tool selected. I could, and this would drive me totally insane, I could grab each of these corners and pull them down independently to these different points, but that takes a long time. So I'm going to undo that. What I need to do is, the other thing I could do is I could say, oh, well, I know if I hold down Shift, it's going to keep these dimensions. So if I hold down Shift and click and drag, it's going to keep the dimensions, but it's going to pull it down to that opposite corner, right? Which isn't what we want. We would really like this thing to scale around the center. And so to do that, I'm going to go ahead and undo what I just did. To do that, I need to hold down the Shift key and the Option or Alt key. And then hover over this corner, click and drag, and it will scale it down towards the center of the object. And so what I can do is then I can get it so these points are right on the edge of this other box, and release. And now I have rotated and scaled this object so that it is at a 45-degree angle to its original orientation. So now we're going to do a brief introduction to opacity and blending mode. So we've got our square here, and it's kind of boring. We'd like to have a little bit more interest in here. So I'm going to select the interior square object, and I'm going to come up here to opacity. And this is one of the options that we have in the control panel. And so with the opacity, it's currently set to 100. I'm going to pull this down to 50 just to show you what happens, right? So now this top object is 50% opaque. And we start to get some interesting things happening here where it looks like it almost has some sort of dimension, right? It looks like it's a shaded square because there's these darker halves that you can see through. However, it also looks like it's really washed out. The color isn't very vivid or bright. And so what we can do is up here, this is something that holds true for any single one of these bright orange letters or words, such as opacity and stroke. they're clickable. If I click on this, it opens up the transparency pane. And this, again, I can set the opacity here, but it also allows me to change the blending mode. The blending mode is this thing where it says normal. And blending mode doesn't matter all that much unless you're working with transparencies. And so let's go ahead and change this to multiply. What multiply does, as you'll see, is it basically allows you to darken colors with the object that you have on top of the other object, but it maintains more vivid color when you do it. There's several other options. We could also do an overlay, which will brighten the underlying colors. You can experiment with any of these, right? Color burn really keeps the colors vivid. Difference changes things dramatically, right? You can experiment with what each one of these does, but to start with, I'm just going to go ahead and I was actually really happy with color burn. So I'm going to leave this set to color burn. And you'll notice that if you change the opacity now, you can make this much stronger and brighter. You can also make the effect more weak by lowering the opacity, right? So I'm going to leave my opacity at 50% because that seems pretty nice the way it is. But I want to add one more level of detail to it. And so to do that, I'm going to select this object, and we're going to do the same steps we did before. We're going to copy and paste in front, and then rotate it for 45 degrees and scale it down around the center. And this is just give a little bit more practice. So I either need to hit Command or Control C to copy it, and then Command or Control F to paste in front. And you'll notice this becomes more apparent now that I have this opacity set to 50% and the mix mode changed. You can tell the difference that there are now two of these things, these 50% opaque layers layered directly on top of one another. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hover over the corner, hold down Shift, click and drag, and I'm going to rotate this thing. I'm just going to rotate it once this time. I have no idea what this is going to look like exactly, but we'll go for it. And then I'm going to hover over one of these corners. I'm going to hold down Shift and Option so that I can scale this right down around the center. And you'll see that as I get close, it's going to snap to the outside dimensions of that. And I'm going to release it. Now this is just making things look a little darker. If I click off, so I deselect it, you can see it's making some changes there. But let's go ahead and change the mix mode on this as well while we're at it. Sorry, the blend mode. So I'm going to click on the word opacity. I'm going to do overlay, and I'm going to bring the opacity up to make it really pop out a bit more. So now that I'm happy with the layout of this one quadrant, what I need to do is I need to copy and paste these 3 more times in order to fill this background in. And to do that, I could just select everything and hold down Option, click and drag. However, that's going to get a little messy. So what I'd like to do is I'd like this whole thing to be a group, right? So groups can be within other groups. It's called nesting. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command or Control G to group all of these things once I select them all, right? So I'm going to click and drag to select all of them, hit Command or Control G. And then now that this is a group, I can select it as a single object, which is wonderful. Now I can hold down Option, click and drag, and release. And I've got my 2 groups here. And then if I go ahead and hold down Shift and select both groups, I can hold down Option or Alt one more time, click and drag, and snap this into place in the bottom of the rectangle. And that concludes drawing the background. What I would like you to do now is you need to save the file. Right? And so to save this file, we're going to hit Control S in Windows or Command S on the Mac, or go to File and Save. I'm going to be saving this in my Online Assets folder, and I'm just going to save it as background _ monkeyface.ai. .ai is the standard file type for Adobe Illustrator files. And so I'm going to go ahead and click Save, and it's going to pop up a couple windows. The first one says version Adobe Illustrator CC and whatever your version number is. Ideally, you're going to save it in that version number. There are certain times when you will need to save it in an older version of the software. And that's because maybe you need somebody else that you're sending this artwork to for some other sort of modification, or maybe you're going to get it put on stickers or something like that. They might only have Adobe Illustrator CS6 or something like that. So some of the effects you might have put on your image wouldn't translate to the earlier versions. But for the simple graphics we're doing, that's going to be fine. It's not going to be an issue. So we're just going to hit OK. And now you'll see that we've saved it. It's background_monkeyface.ai.